When you look back on your life, do you have regrets that you could have done more? Then I went back and watched the violence last night, the vandalism, the disgusting things you see here, and I just cried. I lived in Hong Kong more than half my life. I love Hong Kong, I love China. My first impression of Hong Kong was the heat, the smell, the humidity, and all the things that normally hit Westerners when they step out of a nice green English countryside and step into very busy, crowded Hong Kong. I'm English, I'm a graduate in physics and engineering, and I came to Hong Kong in 1981. I ended up traveling to almost every part of China and seeing each part gradually open up, become more prosperous, become better, more developed, and it was like sort of flowers blossoming all over China. As far as I can see, China's growth has been incredibly fast, not just linear, but almost exponential. So fast, I think, it's taken the world by shock, because it's happened without the world really realizing that China has suddenly come from, by Western standards, a relatively poor country, to the second biggest economy of the world, and it's happened overnight. When I started working in China in the mid-80s, of course, at that time I hadn't learned Chinese. I was reading a lot of the Western press, the South China Morning Post, and the reports I saw painted a very negative impression of China. You know, this communist China. And this was, I think, the impression that almost everybody in the West had at that time, and I was no different. But when I actually started working in China, and remember this was the 1980s, I was very surprised. This wasn't what I'd read about at all. What was reported in the Western press as bad, negative, I found actually was fun. It was lively, it was a free society, relatively speaking. It was very open, and it was developing very fast, completely contrary to the news. And for several months I was very confused, because as a scientist, you look at the facts and you make your deductions based on the facts. You don't make a theory and then try and look for facts to prove that theory. What I was seeing was something very different from what I'd been led to believe, and I wondered, was the news that I was reading wrong, or was what I was seeing wrong, or were my conclusions wrong? And in the end, I came firmly to believe that what I was seeing was the truth, and what I was reading was basically negative, false news. So I think the situation now is far, far worse than it was back in the 80s. The West has gone backwards in terms of honest reporting about China. Western friends, they send me news reports by reporters who've been here, not just coming in for 1 or 2 days, but coming in for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, reporting about the protests in Hong Kong, going to China, reporting about China. And quite frankly, I'm totally shocked at what I read. I say, what country are you talking about? How can you consider this responsible reporting? What you're reporting is rubbish. It's just totally biased. It's as if you watch every American movie and everybody's shooting each other, and as if you go to every American street and people are banging guns at each other all the time. I mean, it's just nonsense. The whole West is combining to try and portray China in the worst possible light. They're reporting every tiny bit of bad news, the same about Hong Kong. They're not reporting the good things about China. They're not reporting the positive things. They're just focusing on things which appeal to Western readers, because they like to read bad news. They don't want to believe that China is developing so fast. They're scared, I think, to see China developing so fast and so suddenly. It's taken them by shock. I think this is a tragedy. Occupy Central in 2014 I thought was bad enough. I used to go out talking to the students at night and telling them what they were doing actually was not helping democracy. It's actually delaying, pushing back any chance of this happening in Hong Kong. What's happened in the last 6 months in Hong Kong, I think, is an absolute tragedy. It went from peaceful protests to violent protests to rioting to petrol bombs. There's a news report today that they've discovered a small group of people building fragmentation bombs in the new territory. And this doesn't even make headline news. It's as if firebombing an MTR station is just like a small robbery of a jewellery shop or something like that. It really is a tragedy. And the people doing this and the people behind it, they're basically evil. When I went out in Occupy Central, and there was quite a lot of unrest in the universities, they were too young to ever understand Hong Kong before the handover. They had this image of, Hong Kong under the British was great, wonderful, and then suddenly 1997 came, the handover, and China's taken over and it's interfering with the two systems, although we're one country. And there's a new generation of radicals, people in their late 30s, early 40s, people like Ted Hui, people like Eddie Chu. These are radicals who are then radicalizing the new generation of students. In particular, since smartphones have become so prevalent, if you see any young person anywhere, they're in the lift, they're in the shopping, they're just looking at their smartphones 24 hours a day. And it's the simplest thing in the world to radicalize people who are receiving their news non-stop, 24 hours a day, just from their social media. What's happened now, I believe, is that we're 5 years further on. Now there's an even younger generation, and these are not just students, but they're also teenagers, who literally have no knowledge at all of what it was like under British rule. They still have this idealized image of Hong Kong under the British. But ever since Hong Kong became a British colony, the English never did anything to try and introduce democracy. So they still have this idealized image of England. That's why they go waving Union Jacks and Hong Kong flags and so on, and American flags. What I wish is that they would implement the law a lot faster. Some of the people who took part in the Mong Kok riots, I think about 3-4 years ago, they've only just recently been brought to trial. So some of the people now who are being arrested, I hear it's almost 5,000. It could be 5, 6, 7 years before they're all brought to trial, which is far too late for deterrent sentences to have any effect on the people who are rioting now. So I think the problem is not the rule of law, but the speed of implementing the law. It needs to be implemented much faster in order that people realize that they cannot be excused for this kind of behavior. And believe you me, this kind of behavior, this kind of rioting, the violence, the vandalism, smashing up the MTR stations, beating up people, a man was killed by a brick, another man set on fire. I mean, any other country in the world, democratic countries included, would never stand for this. America would have called out the National Guard. They'd probably have called out the army by now. In England, the Special Air Force, there would have been riot police on a scale 10 times, 100 times what you're seeing in Hong Kong. France, Germany, the same. They don't allow these kind of demonstrations in Germany or France. They're taken away and locked up and sentenced. And real bullets would have been fired eventually with this kind of thing going on. Yes, read some modern history. Read some modern history about the West, about England, about America. And read some very, very modern Chinese history. Don't stop at 1976. When Mao passed away and Deng took over. Read what's been happening in China and go to China. Another problem, and this is, you can't deny this, Most of those young people who are protesting, I talk about the younger people, the under 25s, and those are the majority of the ones who are rioting. They have never been to China. They don't have mainland Chinese friends. They've certainly never worked in China. They have this twisted, distorted image of China, which is completely wrong. So I would say, go to China and see for yourself. Don't just take a couple of tourist trips and think you've seen China. Go and study there. Do a year's academic exchange in a Chinese university. Meet some real Chinese people. And do what I did in the 80s when I first started coming to China, working there. Instead of reading the newspapers, I went and looked and observed and saw myself what was going on, and I realized that what I was seeing was the truth. So to young people, particularly those who are younger, under 25, who don't know what it was like before 1997, go to China, see what it's really like for yourself, and then decide what you want to do. Don't listen to these pan-democratic radical leaders in Hong Kong. They have their own private agenda. Don't listen to America. Go and see for yourself. I think many people, when they get to retirement age or even past retirement age, they look back and say, actually, I was very selfish. I just thought about myself. I just thought about earning money. I could have done so much more to try and change society and leave something good behind, but I didn't. And so maybe the last years of their life they live in perpetual regret because they realize their conscience is not clean. I've made mistakes. I don't think anybody can make any progress without making mistakes, but when I've made mistakes, I've tried to correct those mistakes and learn from those mistakes. And I think that by contributing in whatever way I can, particularly now at these critical times, is doing the best I can. I'm actually quite glad because I believe that unless Westerners who've lived and worked in China and can see the good things, unless we do speak out, the world will still be getting the negative news that I referred to beforehand. I think people like myself have a duty to speak out and try and get the truth across. I'm not sure how many people will see this interview eventually, how far it will go, but if it makes a little difference, then I'm happy to have made that little difference. No, I insist on no present. I would just rather shake hands with the three of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.